Compared to the average human lifespan, 1,000,000 years is an almost unimaginable amount of time. But from the point of view of the time of existence of our planet, it is not something tangible. If we imagine that our planet lived only a day and not 4.5 billion years, then 1,000,000 years would be less than 20 seconds in this day. Therefore, our planet 1,000,000 years ago practically did not differ from modern Earth in terms of global changes. But small differences were still present, and most important of them, the lack of modern people. Today, we'll tell you who our ancestors were and how they lived around that time. By subscribing to the Age of Dinosaurs channel, you will be the first to know about the releases of new videos dedicated to the history and the development of life on our planet. Also, our viewers can express their opinion about the watched video in the comments and rate them with likes. 1,000,000 years ago, during the Pliocene epoch, our planet was experiencing another global cooling, and the main difference of that time from ours are connected precisely with this. It would be impossible to estimate how much the continents were shifted relative to their current position without special calculations and instruments. To the naked eye from space, they would have been located in the same places as now. But the climate was much colder. Changes in geology as well as flora and fauna would have been noticeable. Since the ice caps at the poles were noticeably larger and the glaciation extended a considerable distance from the poles, the absence of some reservoirs and islands as well as the presence of land bridges between some territories would be striking. The most notable and important land bridge was, without a doubt, the route connecting Asia and North America. On the site of the modern Bering Strait, there was an isthmus, the presence of which, according to scientists, allowed people and some animal species to populate first North, then South America. The British and Japanese islands were also connected to the mainland. Then, what we now know as Japan was not a chain of separate pieces of land in the ocean, but represented a single whole with the Korean peninsula. Britain, on the other hand, was united with Europe, not in a political, but in a geographical sense. The appearance of land bridges was due to the fact that large amounts of water in the form of ice accumulated at the poles. According to scientists, the average climate of the planet was 5 to 10 degrees colder, and the level of the world's oceans was lower by more than 100 meters. At the same time, due to the ice cover, there were no objects such as the Baltic Sea and the Great Lakes on the world map. Moreover, in the United States, there was just another array of large freshwater lakes. It was located in the western part of the continent. The retreat of the glacier has led to the disappearance of the reservoirs and the appearance of the 5 connected lakes on the US-Canada border. The Baltic Sea is the youngest sea on the planet. It is estimated at 10 to 15,000 years old. Due to the low level of the world's oceans, dust storms often passed over the surface of the planet. Coniferous trees predominated in the plant world of the Earth. Of modern hardwoods, oaks, and beeches already existed, but basically the land, especially at the distance from the equator, was covered not with forests, but with tundra and steppes. Representatives of the so-called mammoth fauna dominated the animal kingdom. In addition to the mammoths themselves, these were the most diverse ungulates. Among the predators are the famous saber-toothed tigers, cave lions, and bears. The modern man, or Cro-Magnon, did not exist yet, but the ancestors of people who originated in Africa have already begun their journey to populate the entire planet. True, they still didn't stand out much from other animals, and most often were less weak creatures, but thanks to the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions of life, some of them were able to achieve some success. In particular, some of them were able to move to Asia and Europe with the help of a land bridge. Among the early hominids known to science, there are several species that could be our ancestors or developed in parallel in conditions of serious competition for the title of dominant creature. One of them was a skilled man, or Homo habilis. This species is considered the first representative of the genus Homo. He appeared on the territory of the African continent about 2 million years ago, and by the period described has mastered many skills that speak of his serious mental abilities. The habilis made their living by both gathering and hunting. They also knew how to make primitive tools from stone and wood. The growth of these hominids was about 160 centimeters. They walked on 2 legs. Moreover, the thumb on them was no longer set aside. The teeth of the habilis were smaller than those of the great apes and were comparable in size to the teeth of modern humans. An important feature of these primitive people was the change in the structure of the larynx. They found formations responsible for the creation of speech centers. That is, the habilis could well communicate with each other with the help of voice. Unlike the habilis, who only lived in Africa, the remains of Homo erectus have already been found outside this continent. It appears the living period was from 1.85 million years ago to 400,000 years ago. The ancestors of modern people gave rise to the settlement of mankind in Asia and Europe. Erectus had a fairly large brain, which was not much inferior to the size of the brain of a modern human. They also have a very similar skeleton structure to us. In the development of their skills, this species was far ahead of many of its contemporaries. Homo erectus knew how to use fire and build primitive dwellings. Also, his devices for hunting and fishing were more advanced than those of the Homo habilis. Erectus lived in small groups. It is believed that they began to master the manufacturing of clothing and the preparation of products for the future. In the future, scientists distinguished several subspecies of Homo erectus which lived in different parts of the planet. The so-called Heidelberg man lived in Europe. Pithecanthropus or Javanthropus lived on the Pacific Islands in modern Southeast Asia, and Sinanthropus lived in China. It is believed that the Pithecanthropus, as a result, turned out to be a dead-end branch of the development and did not have any influence on the development of the genus Homo sapiens. Their descendants were isolated on the islands and gradually degraded. Perhaps the last of them became victims of the future Australian Aborigines, who about 100,000 years ago moved from island to island on their way to the Green Continent. The main interest for science among all kinds of people who lived 1 million years ago is the Heidelberg man. In terms of growth and brain size, he was practically in no way inferior to modern people. It is believed that this particular species is the common ancestor of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. But externally, Heidelberg man was closer to Neanderthals than to us, although the structure of the dental arc of the Heidelberg man is almost identical to ours. Like other types of ancient people, they appeared in Africa, but then some of them moved to Europe. It is possible that these populations did not have any contact with each other for a long time, developing separately. It is well known that this species used fire and created quite advanced tools and weapons. It was also customary for them to take care of their fellow tribesmen. Perhaps they possessed a rudimentary religion and art. In general, the conditions of life on the planet 1 million years ago were quite comparable with modern ones, and the hominids who lived at that time already quite resembled people. And before the appearance of the first Cro-Magnons, who were already 100% people of the modern type, there was one small evolutionary step left, a few seconds on the clock of the development of the planet Earth. Our planet experienced another glaciation 500,000 years ago. The continents were already located in the places similar to us, but the climate and nature were very different from our time. Despite such harsh conditions, the ancestors of modern people continued to develop more and more new spaces for life. This time was the heyday of such a type of people as Neanderthals. And nothing foreshadowed that in a few 100,000 years, they would disappear under the onslaught of a more adapted and developed competitor. As you know, any ice age is not a long and static glaciation starting from the poles. Ice ages consist of periodic thaws and cold snaps within certain temperature ranges. But in the period of 500,000 to 20,000 years ago, glaciers in Europe reached Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Volgograd. The North American ice sheet covered half of the continent, and along the Mississippi River Valley, it practically reached the line of the tropics. The thickness of the ice in Scandinavia and the United States reached 3.5 to 4 kilometers. A similar situation was in the area of the South Pole. Such gigantic masses of ice could not be influenced by the climate in other territories. Therefore, vast territories were occupied by tundra, forest tundra, and semi-deserts. The tundra was located at the latitudes of the modern Central European states. The territories of modern France and Germany were vast grassy plains with sparse forests. Woodlands reached the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. This time was the heyday of the so-called mammoth fauna. In the period from 750 to 500,000 years ago, the final separation of the steppe mammoth from the southern one took place, and it began its settlement in Europe, Asia, and North America. Huge herd of large ungulates, such as woolly rhinoceros, bison, various types of horses, and deer, also migrated across the tundra and forest steppes. Predators were represented by a large number of variety of cats, as well as wolves and bears. Simultaneously with the mammoths, the ancestors of people, who are commonly called Neanderthals, also left Africa. It is believed that they appeared about 600,000 years ago. Following the periodically retreating glaciers, their population spread farther north and east. Until recently, it was believed that they were a dead-end branch of development, and only the Cro-Magnons, who appeared about 40,000 years ago, could be our ancestors. But when it became possible to conduct gene research, it turned out that the DNA of many modern human populations, Neanderthal genes are present along with the genes of other ancestors of modern people. Physically, Neanderthals were more adapted to the harsh conditions of life on Earth at that time, but they were inferior in the development of technology and culture. Therefore, they lost the race for the survival of their species. But their way of life, culture, and other features are of great interest to scientific study. Their average height was about 165 centimeters. They had a heavy skeleton, and their muscle mass was about 30 to 40% higher than the muscle mass of modern people. Also, Neanderthals had a low sloping forehead and large cheekbones with strong jaw muscles. The nose of these ancient people was wide. Its shape and dimensions ensured the warming of the inhaled air. The striking features of their appearance were largely superciliary arches and a small chin. The neck of the Neanderthals was massive and short. The structure of their vocal apparatus indicates the ability to pronounce coherent sounds. That is, we can definitely say that Neanderthals could talk to each other. It is also believed that they had no facial hair, but this hypothesis has not yet received 100% confirmation. An interesting opinion about the mode of movement of Neanderthals was expressed by researcher Karen Steidl-Numbers. He believed that since these creatures had shorter and more massive limbs, their step was shorter than that of the Cro-Magnons. Because of this, the Neanderthal had to expend more energy on walking and other activities with his hands and feet. Neanderthals obtained food through hunting and gathering. At the heart of their diet were foods such as meats, nuts, and roots. DNA studies of these ancestors of modern humans showed that in adulthood, the gene responsible for the absorption of lactose was blocked in them. That is, they could only eat milk only in their early childhood. In general, it is believed that adults were able to start drinking milk of various animals only with the advent of dairy farming. Before that, for an adult, it was almost poison. Most likely, Neanderthals lived in small tribal communities of up to 30 individuals. They actively used fire for cooking, roasting dishes, and making various tools. Contrary to popular belief, they did not use caves as dwellings. Archaeological finds say that their sites were most often located in the steppe along the course of nomads. Near the caves, they could equip their dwellings with skins, wood, and bones. Near the caves, they could equip their dwelling from skins, wood, and bones. And Neanderthals could enter the caves themselves only for a short time in search of shelter or to perform rituals or other cultural activities. For example, in caves, they could bury their dead relatives. A large number of such cave burials have been found on the territory of Europe and the Middle East. In the cave of La Chapelle-Haute-Seine in France, a characteristic and well-preserved burial of this type was found. A Neanderthal skeleton was located in a shallow grave in the fetal position. Traces of food and flowers were found next to it, which are considered to be funeral attributes. One of the most famous burials associated with Neanderthals was found in the Shanidar cave in Iraq, in the grave of an adult man who was about 40 years old, which by those standards was rather old. A large amount of flower pollen was found. Here, the opinions of researchers are divided. Some considered it a sign of some type of ritual. Others think that the pollen was part of a drug which they tried to use to cure the man. Scientists have not yet come to a consensus on whether Neanderthals had any single religious cult. There is practically no grave goods in the graves of these ancient people. Many burials are located right on the sites of their permanent settlements, but there is an opinion that often they do not belong to relatives, but to be killed and perhaps eaten by enemies. There is practically no reliable information about the culture of Neanderthals. At one time, they were credited with the invention of the first musical instrument. During the excavations, the so-called bone flute was discovered, a piece of bone with 4 holes. But there is an opinion that the holes may have been hyena teeth marks, although some, especially musical Neanderthal, might have extracted some sounds from such a bone without thinking of the nature of the holes. But no other evidence of Neanderthal-made musical instruments has yet been found. Primitive wooden spears and clubs were used as weapons for hunting and war. Neanderthals did not possess any throwing weapons like a bow or a sling. The collection of roots was carried out with the help of special digging knives, and for the manufacturing of jewelry, simple drills were used. Such decorations were most often the teeth and claws of animals or shells. Reliable evidence of the presence of paintings or sculptures among Neanderthals has not yet been found. All the alleged objects of art or the presence of some special culture have so far turned out to be the only attempts to bring the question under the answer. But it has been reliably proven that they had ideas about medicine and care for their fellow tribesmen. Many skeletons found have preserved traces of high-quality treatment of fractures and other injuries. It's also known that old people and cripples lived among them, who perhaps were entrusted with feasible work. So, the Neanderthals had all the prerequisites for the development of society to a higher level, but the cruel laws of evolution did not allow them to move on to the next step. Or maybe the history of mankind would have gone in a completely different way if the race for survival had been won by these creatures and not our direct ancestors. Over the past 40,000 years, man has practically not changed in his structure. Despite the huge difference in technological, scientific, and cultural development, it can be said already at that time our species was formed in its present state. True, some scientists believe that certain differences between us and our ancestors still exist. Also, the more distant these people are from us in time, the more features inherent in Neanderthals are present in their genotype. Today, we will try to figure out where a modern type of person came from and can we be considered Cro-Magnons. If you are interested in questions of the origin of species and the history of the development of our planet, then we recommend subscribing to our channel. Also, our viewers can help in its promotion by leaving comments under the videos and liking the videos. The word Cro-Magnon comes from the name of the French cave Cro-Magnon, in which the first remains of this type of people were discovered in 1868. The researchers found several male and female skeletons of varying degrees of preservation with tools and other items. Now, in the scientific community, the term Cro-Magnon in the narrow sense can refer both to people found in this cave or living on the territory of the European continent in the period from 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, and to the entire population of the Earth during the Upper Paleolithic. But saying that Cro-Magnons were similar to modern people, it is worth noting that the inhabitants of different parts of our planet have a huge number of differences. So what did the Cro-Magnons look like, and what race or nationality people are more similar to our common ancestors? In some early reconstructions, the Cro-Magnon is depicted as an exact copy of a modern European with blonde hair, a narrow straight nose, and a rather slender figure. But modern methods of analysis give an accurate idea that these ancient people were overwhelmingly swarthy or even black-skinned, had dark hair and eyes. The presence of light eyes among the Cro-Magnons was a big exception. It is believed that the indigenous inhabitants of Australia and the Pacific Islands have almost completely preserved the appearance that they inherited from their ancestors from the distant Paleolithic. And to a large extent, this is true. Several tens of thousands of years ago, the population of Europe was a people with a more massive figure than ours, with a flattened face and a more advanced chin. But the Cro-Magnon nose was not as flat and wide as that of the Australian Aborigines or the inhabitants of Africa, and the jaws protruded much less. They received these signs much later in the process of settling around the world. But the most interesting thing is that there are external differences between people from the Upper Paleolithic, whose remains were found in different places, were more diverse than the differences between all the people that inhabit the Earth now. Scientists explain this fact by the fact that then people lived in small groups of several dozen people. Most of them were relatives, and therefore each such small group had its own distinctive external features. Thus, we can conclude that people who lived in Europe about 20 to 30,000 years ago outwardly differed slightly from modern Europeans, and at the same time were very different from each other. Common features of all Cro-Magnons, in which they did not look like modern people, can be called a larger and more massive skull with protruding superciliary arches and protruding face with a large palate and wide cheekbones. Their height could reach 180 to 190 centimeters. Their limbs were elongated. This type of physique is now inherent in the inhabitants of the tropical regions of the Earth. It is believed that such a body structure contributed to faster movement and helped well in hunting. Also, people of the Cro-Magnon type are characterized by angular eye sockets and a narrow, protruding nose. But one of the most important features of this type of people was the brain of a large size. According to some reports, its volume could reach 1,800 cubic centimeters. On average, it was 1,500 cubic centimeters. This is even somewhat more than that of modern inhabitants of our planet. The average brain volume of a modern person is about 1,300 cubic centimeters. The Cro-Magnon skull was distinguished by thick walls and a strongly protruding nape. With a high probability, these signs came to them from the Neanderthals, who were undoubtedly their ancestors. Various components of Neanderthal DNA are present in many fossils around the world. For example, in the Sungurevsky burial ground near the city of Vladimir, a skeleton of a man about 180 centimeters tall, with broader shoulders than the rest, was found. It is believed that this giant had a large admixture of Neanderthal DNA. But for the most part, Cro-Magnons were dry and hot. At the same time, they were quite muscular, with long legs and a short torso. The earliest finds of the remains of people with signs of this type date back to the period from 100 to 200,000 years ago. They are found in Africa and a little later in the Middle East. And in the period from 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, these people already lived throughout Europe. actively pushing the Neanderthals to less habitable territories. A little more than 10,000 years ago, the Cro-Magnons had already begun to populate the American continent, crossing the Bering Strait along the resulting land bridge. From all of the above, we can conclude that the Cro-Magnons, who lived from about 10 to 40,000 years ago, were very similar to us. But at the same time, among the ancient people themselves, there was a huge number of external differences. Despite the fact that our origin from the Cro-Magnons is currently indisputable, scientists are inclined to believe that representatives of different races and peoples descended from different groups of these same Cro-Magnons. The latest finds of the remains of people of a purely Cro-Magnon type date back to a period of 6,000 to 9,000 years ago. After that, with the transition to a settled way of life and the advent of the Neolithic economy, various populations began to acquire their own different external features. Such variability, although in a lesser form, is also observed among those people who, for a long time, remained exclusively hunters and gatherers. Although the common features that distinguish Cro-Magnon type people from our other ancestors have more or less been preserved in all modern people. Although, in the cultural and technical sense, the Cro-Magnons were much inferior to modern people, but in terms of ingenuity and ability to be creative, they could perhaps give us a serious head start. Having started their life journey with the simplest spears and clubs, they were able to invent and master not only the spear thrower, but also the bow. They also created unique drawings on the walls of the caves, developed funeral and magical rites, and had their own idea of medicine and possibly religion. It is believed that rock art in the caves of the European Alps, the Ural Mountains, and other habitats of the people of the Upper Neolithic era had more of a religious and magical meaning. These drawings depicted various animals accompanied by the designation of arrows or spears. Scientists suggest that these pictures were associated with hunting rituals or initiation rites for hunters. But the intricate carvings on the handles of knives and other tools, as well as the decorations on garments, could well have been an aesthetic thing. During the excavations of a huge number of sites of ancient people, a large number of figurines made of stone and bone were found. Among the funeral inventory, there were also household items and weapons. Also, the Cro-Magnons were the first to tame wild animals. The first assistant of ancient people was the domesticated wolf, from which all breeds of domestic dogs subsequently descended. Some scientists believe that this symbiosis greatly increased the efficiency of hunting and became the main reason for the successful development of this type of people. It was these qualities and achievements that made our ancestors the dominant species and allowed them to spread throughout the planet, destroying or assimilating their natural competitors. Being the direct descendants of these ancient hunters and gatherers, the modern inhabitants of the Earth can overcome all the natural disasters that are coming in the future and remain the masters of this planet for many more thousands of years. But for this, it is necessary to draw the right lessons from the history of their development and direct the inherited ingenuity and ability to adapt to changes in the right direction. Why did all types of ancient people die out except Homo sapiens? According to the laws of the evolutionary development of living nature, competition is usually won by a more adapted and stronger species. We are now the only human species on the planet, but at the dawn of their appearance, our distant ancestors had to withstand serious competition with other contenders for the title of King of Nature. In this video, we'll talk about who else lived and developed in parallel with our species and why the Cro-Magnons turned out to be stronger and more successful. If you like the videos that are released on the Dinosaur Age channel, then you can help promote them. To show our videos to many viewers as possible, you just need to like the videos that you like. We encourage our viewers to actively subscribe to the channel and share their opinion in the comments. If natural disasters and other factors do not come into play, then those animals and plants quickly adapt with their change in living conditions and develop adaptations that are absent from the opponent should they win in the struggle for survival. The main weapon of our distant ancestors turned out to be a more developed intellect and a high level of socialization. Also, our development was strongly affected by the constant change in conditions in the course of settling around the planet. All kinds of people who could compete with the Cro-Magnons appeared on Earth long before them. And by the time a new kind of people came into their territory, they had a serious head start in preparing for the struggle for a place under the sun. They had already adapted to climate conditions, developed their own survival strategy, learned how to use and make various necessary tools. It is believed that thanks to their developed brains, the Cro-Magnons quickly adopted and improved the necessary skills from the indigenous inhabitants. And then they were simply forced out to move to severe habitats. Moreover, this displacement did not take place in the form of an armed clash. Just because of its sociality and mass character, the Cro-Magnon society quickly developed territories and resources, and the locals were forced to be content with the remnants or move to a new place. At different times and in different parts of the planet, simultaneously with representatives of the species Homo sapiens, from 5 to 8 other types of people lived on Earth. Different groups of scientists classify these species in different ways, sometimes separating them, sometimes combining them into common groups. All these species had a common ancestor, but at some point, the branches of their development were divided. Also, scientists cannot always accurately indicate the time of residence of these related species. So, it's not at all a fact that they died out with the help of our distant ancestors. According to the various estimates, the Cro-Magnons appeared on the territory of the African continent from 100 to 200,000 years ago. And about 50,000 years ago, they left Africa and began their settlement around the world. And after 30,000 years, not a single parallel developing human species remained on Earth. All of them were either exterminated or driven back by the new masters of the planet to uninhabitable regions. Perhaps some of them were simply assimilated into the Cro-Magnon society. Evidence for this theory can be found in the presence of genes from other species in modern humans. Although some scientists believe that we inherited these genes from common ancestors, different types of people could not interbreed among themselves. Cro-Magnons lived in groups of up to 100 people. They knew how to build dwellings from skins or equipped dugouts. They could also live in caves. They dressed in skins. But one of the most important qualities of this kind of people was the ability to articulate and fully communicate with each other. This skill helped them hunt more organized. Therefore, the Cro-Magnons could jointly produce such a large prey as deer, mammoths, and other large mammals. In addition, these primitive people mastered the manufacturing of huge number of various useful devices and tools. A spear thrower helped them hunt better. A device capable of throwing a spear more than 100 to 120 meters. With the help of snares, it was possible to catch small animals and birds. And as for catching fish, harpoons and hooks were invented. An important addition to all of this was the domestication of domestic animals. Scientists say that around this time, the dog was domesticated by man. Findings related to the cultural life of the Cro-Magnons also speak of a high level of development. They left us a lot of art objects, drawing on the walls, decorations, and even children's toys. Scientists also talk about the rather complex funeral rites of our ancestors. All this means that primitive people could devote enough time to activities not related to the extraction of food and survival. What other types of people could oppose to this mass character and organization? Homo naledi. Until recently, it was believed that the remains of one of the dead-end branches of mankind discovered in South Africa belonged to later eras, and these creatures died out long before the appearance of the first Homo sapiens. But recent studies have shown that these remains are only 200 to 300,000 years old. So these primitive people could theoretically meet with the first representatives of our species. Unfortunately, apart from the bones and skulls of Homo naledi, scientists have not found any other finds. In the cave where they rested, there are no traces of any tools, clothing, or other organic matter. Most likely, these creatures were closer to the Australopithecus. Their hands were adapted for moving through trees, and the structure of their legs made it possible to make long transitions and run well. Heidelberg Man. It is believed that this species could be the link from which the separations of sapiens and Neanderthals began. Heidelberg Man outwardly looked like modern people, but the size of his brain was much smaller and inferior to ours, and his height could reach 175 centimeters. Distinctive features of the Heidelberg Man were a massive brow ridge and the absence of chin protrusion, a thick-walled skull, and a low forehead. Moreover, his dental arch practically did not differ from ours. According to various sources, this type of people originated in Africa from 800 to 500,000 years ago, and then also settled throughout Eurasia. It is believed that the African and European branches of the Heidelberg people were isolated from each other for a long time and developed independently. The last finds of the remains of this species date back to around 130,000 years ago. This means that at the dawn of their existence, they could well have interacted with our ancestors. Despite his outward appearance, the Heidelberg Man was distinguished by his great ingenuity. Representatives of this species definitely knew how to use fire and make primitive tools. There is evidence that it was they who first began to use stone tips. Perhaps they knew of art and took care of the old and infirmed fellow tribesmen. They lived in groups of up to several dozen people and hunted together on large creatures. Floresian Man and Javanthropus. In the process of settling the prehistoric ancestors of mankind, some groups of different anthropoid creatures found themselves in forced isolation on the islands. A striking representative of such a population are the inhabitants of the island of Java, who inhabited it about 100,000 years ago. In the process of their evolution, they acquired some unique features that made them a separate kind of people. But, like all closed populations, the Javanthropes were doomed to slow degradation and extinction. Most likely, given the abundance of food and the absence of dangers, they could not resist new predators or competitors that appeared on the island. The same fate befell the inhabitants of the island of Flores. Their degeneration was expressed in a decrease in the size of the body and brain. They appeared on this island about 1 million years ago and died out only about 50,000 years ago. But over the past 450,000 years of their existence, their brain had decreased by more than 2 times. Some researchers believe that the cause of their death could be a major eruption of a local volcano. It is also quite possible that for the last hobbits from Flores were destroyed by representatives of the Homo sapiens, who at the time inhabited the island of the Pacific Ocean, heading towards the Australian continent. Denisov Man. This species was discovered quite recently, and the Denisov Cave in Altai gave it its name. Now, it is believed that they lived through East Asia, but there is practically no data on their life and skills. It is only known that they had dark skin, dark hair, and large teeth. There is evidence that they could have had common offspring with Neanderthals. Denisovan genes have also been found in the DNA of modern humans. Therefore, it is quite possible that the Denisovans were assimilated by another species. Neanderthals. The confrontation between these relatives and ours and the ancient Cro-Magnons is written not only in school textbooks. A lot of believable and not very artistic films have been shot about this topic. It can be reliably said that Neanderthals, before the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe, survived quite normally in these harsh places. They knew how to sew clothes from skin, made devices for hunting and everyday life, mastered the arts, and possessed the rudiments of religion. It is very likely that the more intellectually developed Cro-Magnons, whose tribes were larger, simply forced the Neanderthals to look for new places to live. It is also possible that a general cooling of the climate began at this time, and they simply could not cope with the changes that had occurred. Among the finds of the remains of this species, about 90% of the bones belonged to children. Most likely, this species simply died out due to hunger and deprivation. But our distant ancestors also played a role in this extinction. Throughout history, people have resolved their conflicts primarily with weapons. Mankind waged wars for economic, political, religious, racial, and other reasons. Many scientists suggest that the meeting of our distant ancestors with the Neanderthals could not have ended in anything but a war of extermination. Today, we will try to understand the causes and consequences of this first global war in the history of our planet. If you're interested in information about scientific discoveries and hypotheses in the field of paleontology and anthropology, as well as other related sciences, then we advise you to subscribe to our channel. To promote our videos according to the algorithms, we encourage our viewers to actively share comments and put likes under the releases they like. People against people has always been the reason for the destruction of our own kind. Back in the day of the primitive communal system, any stranger who was at least somewhat different from the locals was perceived as a threat. The simplest and safest solution for the clan or tribe was to kill them. If such a stranger was very different from a representative of one species, then the conversation with him was very short. So the Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals hardly had a chance for a peaceful resolution of the conflict over territory. Despite the almost complete genetic similarity of these two branches of humanity, outwardly, Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals differed very much. Our ancestors, who came to Europe and the Middle East almost 70,000 years later, met here with the Neanderthals, who had been living in this territory for a long time. These natives were shorter than they were, more stocky and broad-shouldered. Also, Neanderthals had a sloping chin, a wider nose, and a massive brow ridge. Their maximum height did not exceed 165 centimeters. The structure of the body of the Cro-Magnons was close to the structure of modern people living in tropical areas. Their height could exceed 180 centimeters. They had long legs, and their faces looked like the current inhabitants of the Earth. It is noteworthy that the brains of babies of both species who entered the struggle for new lands were completely identical. But with age, the differences became more. Although the total brain volume of adults did not differ much, it is believed that the main problem of the Neanderthals in this regard was the less developed cerebellum. This part of the brain is responsible for motor coordination, memory, imagination, and most importantly, speech and social skills. An important survival ability of the Cro-Magnons was the ability to unite in relatively large groups to solve common problems. Neanderthals lived in small, most likely family groups, and although they already had many of the hallmarks of a nascent primitive society, more sociable competitors outstripped them in this component of development. Judging by various archaeological finds, the Neanderthals had concepts of medicine. They took care of the elderly and the crippled. There are suggestions that the concept of religion and art had already begun to emerge in their minds. The simplest explanation for the disappearance of the Neanderthals is their destruction by Homo sapiens. It is quite possible that as such, there was no global armed conflict between these species. It's just that the more numerous and organized Cro-Magnons gradually forced out the indigenous inhabitants of Europe to areas less favorable for living. The process of the destruction of the Neanderthals lasted approximately 30 to 35,000 years as the new owners of the continent settled from Africa. The aliens were able to quickly adapt to colder climates and create better tools and weapons. Neanderthals used only primitive spears and clubs in hunting and war. By the end of the confrontation, their rivals had already successfully used spear throwers. This device made it possible to throw a spear much further. Accordingly, Cro-Magnon hunters were more efficient in obtaining food. Both species successfully used the driven method of hunting, but the Cro-Magnons, who were able to interact more efficiently, most likely managed to collect larger hunting parties. An important difference that could have influenced the extinction of the Neanderthals was the diet of different types of the ancient people. Analysis of the remains of different groups of Neanderthals shows that each of them ate a certain set of foods. Some ate only the meat of local ungulates, some collected certain plants, and some got fish or seafood. The disappearance of familiar food associated with its destruction or relocation of the group to a new place led to significant problems. First of all, in more severe conditions, children died. Decreasing birth rates and increasing mortality naturally led to the extinction of the species. Cro-Magnons, on the other hand, ate about the same regardless of the area in which they lived. Basically, their diet consisted of plant foods. The animal component could differ depending on the region and time period. At the beginning and at the end of their appearance in Europe and Asia, our ancestors used different methods of cooking meat. The closer to our time this period, the more perfect were the methods of cooking and the more varied the diet. It has long been no secret that genetic proximity of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons allowed them to have common offspring. They had a certain common ancestor from which, according to various estimates, both species separated in the period from 200,000 to 1,000,000 years ago. The genes of modern humans contain between 1 and 4% of Neanderthal DNA. Therefore, it is possible that not all of them were destroyed with weapons. Some of them had assimilated by a more advanced species. But more often than not, the conflict of interest ended sadly for one of those parties. You should not think that the Cro-Magnons who came from Africa simply wiped their closest relatives off the face of the earth. Excavations made at the sites of both those and other participants in the events show that Neanderthals were not whipping boys. Scientists regularly find burials with traces of violent death from characteristic weapons. Also, often come across bones with traces of teeth. This shows that both our ancestors and their competitors regularly ate their dead enemies. In addition to these assumptions, some scientists express several more versions. For example, it is believed that an important advantage of the Cro-Magnons in the struggle for a place in the sun was the domestication of the dog. This symbiosis allowed humans to hunt and defend themselves more effectively against threats. The Neanderthals didn't get enough food to survive, but the Cro-Magnons prospered. The founder of this theory, the American scientist Pat Shipman, also believes at the same time Cro-Magnons showed another important property. They have a special mutation as a dominant feature. The sclera of the eyes has acquired a white tint. This allows you to understand where the gaze of the interlocutor is directed. Communication between people became much better, which led to the development of socialization and greater organization. Some scientists suggest that Neanderthals could have been the victim of a global epidemic. They left the African continent 150,000 years earlier than the Cro-Magnons. The microorganisms that appeared during this time, to which they had no immunity, were carried by our ancestors along the entire path of their settlement. These microbes, already safe for Cro-Magnons, caused the extinction of the Neanderthals. Another group of scientists say that the Cro-Magnons did not participate at all in the destruction of their main competitor. Nature herself did it. There is evidence that in places of the greatest concentration of Neanderthals during that period, several large volcanic eruptions occurred. This affected the decrease in temperature and the change in the composition of water and atmosphere. Many animal species that served as the main food of the Neanderthals died out, and after them, starvation awaited people. It doesn't matter which contributed more to the extinction of the Neanderthals. Competition between species occupying the same ecological niche is inevitable in nature. Perhaps under different circumstances, Neanderthals would have had the chance of success, and now human society would exist according to other laws. But to find out if the world of Neanderthals would be better than the one we see now, or we can never get worse. What if we have to rebuild human society from the ground up? Their versions of the end of the world are predicted both in the religious texts of different peoples and confessions, and in world art culture in the forms of films, computer games, and books. And each of these works expresses different views on how people will cope with the consequences of the apocalypse and restore civilization. Today, we will try to guess how far humanity will roll back in its technological development and how difficult it'll be for people to restore the lost knowledge. Viewers who are interested in the development of life on our planet in different periods of its existence and new scientific achievements in this area, we suggest subscribing to our channel. This will allow you to be the first to know about the releases of new videos and leave your comments underneath them. You can also help promote the channel with likes. The cause of the end of the world can be events such as global natural disasters, pandemics of various deadly diseases, or nuclear war. All these events are capable of taking the lives of most of the planet's population and destroying the existing system of production of the necessary goods. But in this video, we're not going to consider the ways to survive in the radioactive wastelands among gangs of marauders or fight hordes of zombies eager to eat everyone they can reach. Let's try to simulate a situation when, as a result of the end of the world, there were suddenly practically no people left on Earth. For example, suddenly all people were infected with a deadly virus, and most of them could not cope with the disease. At the same time, before their death, all of them carefully drowned out all nuclear reactors, stopped transport, drained water at the dams of hydroelectric power plants, parked all vehicles, landed all planes, stopped trains, turned off water, gas, and electricity. That is, the surviving handful of people got a clean and almost safe planet, not affected by radiation, acid rain, hurricanes, tsunamis, and earthquakes, with a familiar climate and other living conditions. Often, there is an opinion that in such case, humanity will roll back to the Stone Age. But it would be more like the Middle Ages. But even in the Middle Ages, throughout their entire length, people lived in different ways. But where we get to live, in the Dark Ages or in the Renaissance, depends on a large number of factors. The survival of mankind and the speed of its return to the modern level depends on many factors. This is the quantitative and qualitative composition of the groups of survivors and the ability of relevant materials, such as information, as well as the social system that people will eventually come to in the first days after the death of the world. Already in the 18th century, scientists began to think about a way to preserve technological and cultural knowledge in the event of the collapse of civilization. In 1751, Denis Diderot published his encyclopedia. In this colossal work, he tried to fit the maximum amount of knowledge, fearing that the then European civilization would disappear, like it happened with the Roman Empire or ancient Egypt. These fears of one of the greatest educators were well-founded. Archaeology tells us that many of these technologies used by ancient Romans were lost in the Middle Ages, and subsequently, people had to reinvent many things. A completely different approach to the restoration of society was proposed in the 20th century by the American psychists Richard Feynman. His theory was that people should receive from previous generations only on the basis from which all other specific data can be derived anew. The scientists believed that this basis can serve as a single phrase. All things are made up of atoms, the smallest particles in constant motion, attracted to each other when there is a small distance between them, but mutually repelling when they are brought closer. It's interesting to think how long it would take for a person who has descended to the level of almost a caveman in his development to be able to unleash this postulate, at least for obtaining the first meals and making tools from them. Probably, civilization will recover faster if people are given a set of simpler and more effective tips. Like the old joke goes, that the only book you need to take with you to a desert island is a textbook on agriculture. And that sounds pretty appropriate. Therefore, not so long ago, science journalist Lewis Dartnell published the book Civilization from Scratch: What You Need to Know to Be Able to Survive After a Global Catastrophe. Although this book also contains a large number of practical tips and recommendations for surviving in a post-apocalyptic environment, this is not the main idea of the author. He says that when writing the book, he tried to make sure that after reading it, an inquisitive person could begin his development, avoiding the mistakes made along the way made by our civilization. Dartnell wants people to get on the right track right away and get where they want to go as soon as possible. But most likely, even with the ideal scenario of the end of the world that was planned at the beginning of the video, it will be very difficult for the surviving people to follow at least some kind of plan. So, back to the first question asked earlier. How many people are needed to restore the human population? Some conditional Adam and Eve will obviously not be enough to obtain the entire diversity of the modern human population. If only a single man and a single woman remain alive, then people will eventually degenerate rather than regain their lost positions. Scientists have determined that among the ancestors of all the tribes that settled on the islands of the Pacific Ocean on the way from Asia to Australia, there were about 70 women capable of childbearing. Accordingly, if a group of people of several hundred people survived, then humanity may have a second chance. It will also be important who these people were before the end of the world. If among them there are a sufficient number of people adapted to work, able to cultivate the land or hunt, then such a group will be able to provide themselves with housing and food. If there are surviving doctors, engineers, or teachers in the group, people will have access to certain technologies. But the main thing is that they should be able to establish a system for transferring this knowledge to future generations. With a high probability, these people will not live in large cities, but will settle in rural areas. At first, they may return to foraging through hunting and gathering. Moreover, at first, the collectors will often visit ruins of dying cities. But gradually, nature will completely absorb and destroy buildings, roads, and bridges. As in ancient times, rivers will become the main trade routes. Along with their shores, the human world will be recreated. When recreating agricultural technologies, humanity will face serious problems. The fact is that most modern plants that are grown on an industrial scale are the result of a long selection and cultivation of the necessary qualities. Without proper fertilizers and proper care, they will either not be able to provide the desired yield or simply die, and people will die after that. Of course, some simple technologies like a windmill or a water wheel can be restored fairly quickly. With minimal knowledge of mechanics and electrical engineering, wind generators can be created and people will be provided with electricity to some extent. But such a familiar thing as an incandescent lamp cannot be assembled without an appropriate level of development of science and technology. After the depletion of all fuel reserves, which also loses quality over time, you will again have to switch to horses. Making even the simplest rubber products on your own will also be very difficult. Synthetic fabrics will disappear. Therefore, after some time, Wool will become the main raw material for the production of clothing. Shoes will again be made only of leather, or even return to the use of wooden shoes or bast shoes. The only resource to which people will have practically no problem is metal. Even with constant corrosion and destruction, the supply of metal objects that mankind now uses will far exceed the needs of a handful of surviving people. For its processing, it will not be necessary to develop mines or smelt ore. True, this may adversely affect the preservation of the remnants of knowledge in geology and metallurgy. But knowing the nature of people, another scenario of life after the end of the world is more likely. It is he who underlies most films, books, and computer games. The surviving people will unite in small tribes and will kill each other for the meager remnants of resources. And with each dead person, a piece of knowledge that could help in the restoration of our society will leave the world. Thanks to everyone who watched the video to the end. You can learn more about the possible options and expected dates for the end of the world, as well as other global catastrophes of the past from other materials posted on the Dinosaur Age channel.